Our final speaker this afternoon is Kristel Smentek, who's Associate Professor of Art History at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Her research focuses on early modern collecting in the art market, particularly in regard to 18th century France, and to artistic exchanges between Asia and Europe. As Colin explained earlier, this symposium was in large part inspired by our exhibition on Mariette upstairs, and to a certain extent, it was Kristel's work on Mariette that inspired the exhibition, especially her 2008 Master Drawings article with the great title, The Collector's Cut, Why Pierre-Jean Mariette Tore Up His Drawings and Put Them Back Together Again. Kristel also published in 2014 a book on Mariette, Mariette and the Science of the Connoisseur in 18th Century Europe. She's been a generous advisor to our exhibition, and it's with great pleasure that I invite her to the stage to talk about Pierre-Jean Mariette, the collector as historian.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm really glad to have the opportunity to talk to you about Mariette, someone who has engaged me for some time. So in 1770, at age 76, Pierre-Jean Mariette reflected on the decades he had invested in studying the graphic arts. And you see Mariette on the left in a print published in 1765, and on the right, a beautifully mounted mid-16th century drawing from his collection by Niccolò dell'Abate. This is how Mariette described his motivations for collecting, and I quote, "The goal I set myself in forming my collection of drawings was to follow step by step the varied progress of art. For Mariette, artist's drawings were at once sites of transhistorical aesthetic experience and valuable historical documents. Far from mere tools of the artist's workshop, artist's drawings were objects of art historical value, worthy of careful framing and preservation, as Mariette's signature blue mounts for his drawings attest. And today I'd like to probe the reasons for his display decisions, arguing that they were motivated by the more widely shared goal among 18th century connoisseurs to study art both empirically and to locate it historically. And this was a study in which artists' drawings were newly theorized as fundamental. More particularly, though, I'd like to assess Mariette's ambivalent reception of the legacy of his 16th century predecessor, Giorgio Vasari, the painter, collector of drawings, and author of the Vitae, or the lives of the most excellent painters, sculptors, and architects, the most widely consulted 16th century text on art. And you see Vasari on the right in the portrait from the 1568 edition, and a frontispiece for the first edition of 1550. Mariette engaged with Vasari throughout his long life, praising, emulating, and disparaging his predecessor in equal measure. Though he dismissed Vasari as a painter, he admired Vasari as the compiler of the Libro dei Disegni, or Book of Drawings, the multi-volume collection of artist sheets he amassed and referenced repeatedly in the Vitae. And so here's one of drawings from Vasari's collection that entered Mariette's collection subsequently. Mariette assiduously sought out drawings once owned by Vasari and consciously modeled his mounts for drawings and his restoration techniques on Vasari's example. But his opinions of Vasari, the biographer, were more mixed. Mariette acclaimed Vasari's Vitae as, quote, "the book to which one must always return," while just as assiduously condemning the Renaissance author's biases, contradictions, and mistakes. And in many ways, I think Mariette sought to fashion himself as a new Vasari, to rival his achievements, and to update his methods for the more enlightened age of the 18th century. Born in 1694, Mariette, whom you see here in the frontispiece to the catalog of his estate sale in 1775, he's up there on the, right there. Mariette worked as a book publisher, letterpress printer, and print dealer from his teenage years until 1750, when he sold the family business. By the 1730s, he had emerged as one of Europe's premier connoisseurs of the graphic arts, particularly of drawings. In 1733, he was honored by a membership in the Florentine Accademia del Disegno, and in 1750, he was nominated a lay member of the French Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture, a rare honor for a former merchant like himself. Mariette's status as a respected connoisseur was secured by his numerous publications, including an illustrated book on Leonardo's caricature drawings first published in 1730, which was a study based on drawings then in the Mariette family collection. He also published a 2-volume treatise on engraved gems and many contributions to several multi-authored books. And Mariette's reputation also rested on his considerable collection of artist drawings, which at his death was said to have contained over 9,400 sheets. And I'm showing you here a pretty famous drawing. This is the so-called Hand of Michelangelo. His collection represented all European schools and periods and included works by the great masters and far less familiar draftsmen. Mariette also left behind copious manuscript notes on artists and printmakers and many annotated books, including a heavily marked copy of Vasari's Vitae. 18th century connoisseurs like Mariette saw themselves as practitioners of a science, with science understood in its 18th century sense as a branch of knowledge based on methodical and rational analysis. And like other sciences of the period, connoisseurship was founded on a commitment to the primacy of empirical evidence and on the comparative visual study of objects, especially artists' drawings. Executed by the artist's own hand and deemed to be purer, less mediated examples of an artist's characteristic manner than finished works, drawings were deemed true originals. According to Roger de Pile, writing in 1699, painters compromised their natural manner in their attempts to achieve certain effects in their canvases, but in drawings they abandoned themselves to their genius, letting themselves be seen as they are. And this claim was repeated throughout the 18th century. The English painter and connoisseur Jonathan Richardson went so far as to reduce paintings to the status of mere copies of an artist's drawn originals. And he pointed out that unlike paintings, which were often executed with the help of studio assistants, drawings were entirely autograph. And Mariette echoed such views when he wrote in 1730 of Leonardo that, quote, "A substantial series of drawings suffice in themselves to convey a complete idea of the merit and character of this famous painter." Or when he wrote in 1741 that, quote, "One only needs Raphael's drawings to demonstrate the sublimity of his genius." It was thus through the comparative analysis of drawings that the connoisseur honed his skills, grounded his hypotheses, and staked his claims to expertise. In this sense, Vasari was a model to be emulated, and no 18th century drawings collector modeled himself more on Vasari than Mariette. And here I'm showing you a set of drawings attributed to Castiglione in Mariette's signature Blue Mount. Vasari's decorative arrangements of drawings and imitations of Renaissance frames in the pages of his libro were the direct inspiration for Mariette's ornamental borders and cartouches, as several visual quotations by Mariette of the libro attest. And on the screen is a rare, intact recto-verso page from the libro with drawings attributed to Filippino Lippi, Botticelli, and Raffaello del Garbo, that is now in the National Gallery in Washington. And this sheet was not in Mariette's collection, but it exemplifies Vasari's characteristic arrangement of multiple drawings within elaborately drawn frames and with identifying cartouches. In other words, it shows the format in which Mariette might have encountered sheets from Vasari's libro. And like Vasari's, Mariette's individual blue paper mounts are anchored by cartouches inscribed with the name of the artist, often emulating Vasari's characteristic lettering. and they're frequently embellished with elaborately drawn borders that simulate the carved moldings of 18th century classicizing frames. And you can see those characteristics here in a drawing attributed by Mariette to the 17th century painter Ribera. And Mariette even adopted Vasari's shading of the drawn frames to give them the illusion of three-dimensionality. So if you look at here, for instance, and then it might be a little harder to see, but the left side of this frame is subtly more shaded than the other side. And through the design of his mats, Mariette inscribed himself into an illustrious lineage of collectors. And in this example, which we saw earlier, a drawing by Raffaello del Garbo, once in Vasari's Libro and now in the British Museum, Mariette does so quite literally, inscribing his own name beneath Vasari's in the upper cartouche here. It is tempting to see Mariette as fashioning himself as a kind of new Vasari, who through the presentation and annotation of artists' drawings preserves both the sheets and information about them for future generations. At the same time, Mariette's more sedate presentation focuses the viewer's attention on individual drawings, and his use of individual mats facilitated a taxonomic flexibility that bound albums of drawings did not. Mounting drawings on independent mats of the same scale and storing them in portfolios facilitated the side-by-side comparative viewing of works from different hands and schools that was deemed essential to 18th century connoisseurial investigation. Mariette's storage methods also allowed for the reordering of drawings within portfolios and for the changes of opinion that Mariette claimed were the inevitable outcome of increasing connoisseurial knowledge. We know that he changed the attributions on his cartouches, or, as you see here, left them empty when he was uncertain about their authorship. And you can see this drawing now attributed to Giovanni Baglione in the exhibition upstairs. You can see that it's empty. Drawings were vital visual and historical evidence for 18th century connoisseurs, and their preservation was a vital concern. And in my recent book, I've analyzed the various ways in which Mariette repaired or completed old master drawings, and in this too, he followed the example of Vasari. But today, I would like to share the most radical of Mariette's interventions with you, and this is his splitting of recto-verso drawings into two separate sheets, a practice which he may well have pioneered. So you're seeing here two sides of what was once one recto-verso sheet of studies of the allegorical figure of night by the 17th century painter Francesco Albani. In 1761, Mariette's collaborator, the Comte de Caylus, wrote admiringly of Mariette's separation of a recto-verso drawing by Raphael, noting that this was not the only instance of such an intervention. And in 1775, in the Mariette sale catalog, the auctioneer Pierre-François Bassin described the collector's separation of the Albani sheet. And Bassin's comment that Mariette split the recto-verso ink drawing into two separate sheets to facilitate their viewing suggests the ink used to draw the figures was beginning to bleed through the paper. As you can see in this drawing from Mariette's collection, he attributed it to Tiepolo. And that Mariette would have undertaken the process to prevent further damage due to ink migration. And scholars have doubted that Mariette could, or actually would, split a drawing. But Mariette himself noted that the Albani sheet was double-sided when he bought it. And in 2001, I was lucky to learn from the paper conservator Judith Walsh, then at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, not only that laid paper could be split, but also how to do it myself. And as the losses to the Albani sheets show, splitting is a fairly risky undertaking. And in the half that's now in Frankfurt, which is the half on the left, you can see that Night has lost her feet and the tips of her wings. And I won't explain the procedure in detail here, as there's a fine video of the process in the exhibition. But I will show you Judith's successful split, in which the two halves came apart rather nicely. And then my far less happy experiment, which was far more instructive, actually. Because in my case, the two halves did not completely separate, and a section of the recto adhered to the verso. So if you look here, you can see it a little bit, I hope, here. And something similar seems to have happened to the Albani sheet and would help to account for the substantial losses along the left edge of the Frankfurt sheet. And other sheets from Mariette's collection suggest he attempted this procedure more than once and with varying results. So a failed split, for example, could explain the rather odd losses and torn edges of this collage of fragments by the 17th century artist Giovanni Lanfranco. Such risks were worth taking in order to preserve valuable documents of the art historical past for the future. Mariette deplored the loss of evidence occasioned by the breakup of Vasari's Libro. In 1767, Mariette claimed that the Libro had been dismembered by unscrupulous French dealers, and that as a result, an unparalleled opportunity for connoisseurs to confirm attributions and to gain knowledge of unfamiliar artists and styles was irreparably lost. It must be said, however, that Jonathan Richardson claimed that Pierre Crozat, the famed early 18th century collector, had a hand in this dismemberment. Mariette doesn't concur. So here another of one of the many sheets from the Libro that entered Mariette's collection, attributed by Vasari to Fra Filippo, and Mariette notes that it's from Vasari's collection in the cartouche. And these were sheets he eagerly sought out. As Mariette reasoned, Vasari had lived during the lifetimes of many of the artists whose work he collected, and in a period, interestingly, before copies of drawings had proliferated. The drawings Vasari amassed were thus more likely to be authentic. All the more reason for Mariette to take seriously Vasari's attributions and to inscribe their Vasari provenance on his mounts. And as you can see here, Mariette also modified Vasari's mounts, adding more regular borders to them, as you can see in the addition of gray paper borders here. Mariette also lifted them from their original backing papers to remount them on his own mats, causing a certain amount of damage to Vasari's drawn frames for them. I think you can see that there have been some reparations, and certainly down here, but it's perhaps far more visible in these. On the left, a drawing attributed to Perugino in the British Museum, and a series of drawings attributed to Leonardo now in the Albertina. And you can see that there are only really remnants of Vasari's, actually up here. And then here it's quite obvious where repairs had to be made. And then you can see, I hope, the edges of the original sheet. At some point between 1730 and 1747, Mariette acquired an intact volume of the Libro, a triumph he announced publicly in 1767 in a new edition of his book on Leonardo's caricature drawings. The album contained architectural and ornament drawings, but how and from whom he acquired it is unknown. As pleased as Mariette was to have the volume, he was also disappointed by its contents. And I quote, "The album has let me see that Vasari is like almost all curieux, or enthusiasts, who without much discernment admit the good along with the mediocre, along with some excellent works. Or rather, along with some excellent works, there are several drawings in this volume that hardly merit the effort of preserving them." As Mariette and his colleagues frequently asserted, a connoisseur's claims to expertise were only as good as his collection. And here, in the Libro album, was rather troubling evidence of Vasari's own gaps in knowledge, evidence which may have cast a further shadow of doubt over the Vitae. And I say a further shadow of doubt because Mariette was decidedly skeptical about the credibility of Vasari's lives. Throughout Mariette's letters and manuscript notes, one senses his impatience with Vasari's errors. As a young man in 1718, writing from Vienna where he was cataloging the print collection of Prince Eugene of Savoy, Mariette complained of his frustration with Vasari's text, Vasari who is, quote, mistaken in so many things. More than 40 years later, in 1760, Mariette similarly complained, Vasari se brouille furieusement, he is terribly muddled. The most obvious instance of Mariette's lifelong dialogue with the Vitae is his own annotated copy of the later Bologna edition, now in the Louvre. The 3 volumes are filled with marginalia and longer notes on inserted slips of paper. Some are Mariette's transcriptions of Federico Zucchero's notes to his copy of the Vitae, or they're manuscript notes from other sources. Others are Mariette's own corrections, his comparisons between the 1550 and 1568 editions of Vasari, both of which he also owned, his notations of the present locations of works discussed, and so on. But Mariette also filled his copy of the Vitae with remonstrations against Vasari's slights and his lapses in judgment. Mariette complained, for example, that Vasari included demeaning details in his life of Leonardo in order to aggrandize Michelangelo, whom he recognized as the principal hero of the Lives. For readers like Mariette, the biases of the Vitae were exacerbated by the lack of agreement between Vasari's claims and the available visual evidence. So after having seen for himself a, quote, barbarous Pietà by Rosso Fiorentino, which is this one now in the Louvre, which Vasari praised in the Vitae, Mariette commented that Vasari's acclaim for the work did him little honor. And Mariette was baffled by Vasari's declarations that the Florentines had invented engraving because there were German prints executed well before any in Italy. And by allowing bias to distort the history of engraving and neglecting to give the Germans their due, Vasari had contravened the code of impartiality by which 18th century connoisseurs worked. And impartiality, in theory at least, guided Mariette's collecting and his scholarly work. And I'm showing you just a few examples. A drawing he attributed to Philippe de Champagne on the left, on the upper right by Franz Snyders, and then the hand of Michelangelo. Mariette's collection of thousands of drawings encompassed examples, as I said, from all European schools and periods. It was through the unbiased, comparative analysis of the works of all eras that knowledge was advanced, and the superiority of some artists and epochs was empirically determined. As Mariette asserted, it was just as important to look at drawings by the Bamboccianti, who were 17th century specialists in low-life rustic scenes, as it was to study the work of Raphael. And here you can see this is in the exhibition upstairs. Mariette attributed this drawing to Peter van Leer, called Il Bamboccio. So this is Mariette. Someone who has spent his entire life looking at the Bamboccianti cannot appreciate the refined works of Raphael. But isn't it also the case that something would be missing for someone who knows only Raphael's manner? Because grand as it is, it will never appear as sublime as it would to someone familiar with all other styles. An unprejudiced empirical approach also demanded that Vasari be defended from blanket attacks on his work. In 1760, Mariette was prompted to write a long note on Correggio's drawings, one that he thought was by Correggio from his collection. And his note was intended for publication in Giovanni Gaetano Botteri's new annotated edition of Vasari's Lives, which was published from 1759 to 60. And the note would, Mariette hoped, serve to defend Vasari against those who charged that his prejudices led him to unfairly characterize Correggio's drawings. In this case, the visual evidence, that is, the drawings by Correggio in Mariette's collection, supported rather than belied, in his opinion, Vasari's lukewarm assessment of Correggio's draftsmanship. Vasari's text was useful, as Botteri's new edition shows, but the model of the Lives itself was questioned by Mariette and his circle. And Mariette's publications, as many have noted, are notable for their de-emphasizing of artistic biography and their focus instead on the formal features of the works of art they discuss. Thus, in Mariette's book on Leonardo's caricature drawings, the quote-unquote facts of his life, as Mariette put it, are relegated to a brief section at the very end of Mariette's lengthy study of the drawings, and the biography itself is cast as an afterthought. If for Vasari the character of the artist was reflected in the character of the art, for Mariette and his colleagues, the constellation of visual, formal elements we now call style was the most fundamental taxonomic principle. It was through changes in personal and regional styles made visible through the close visual analysis of drawings and not on biography that an alternate object-based method for tracing the progress of art emerged, one that we still deploy today. Mariette's project was to build an art historical science from the object up. For connoisseurs like Mariette, scrutiny of the surface particularities of works of art led to a massive work of classification in which drawings were to be ordered into an increasingly precise categorization by school and chronology. In contrast to Vasari, to understand an artist's style, one did not need to know the artist, one needed to know his or her work and place it in relation to that of others. The further task for Mariette and his colleagues was to make public the methodical, analytical, scientific approach to the classification of drawings, first elaborated within the confines of the collector's cabinet and then made public through publications like the Leonardo book. And the larger aim here was the establishment of an empirically grounded canon of approved masters for the regeneration of contemporary art and taste. And here we come back to Vasari's example, for Mariette had internalized the cyclical model of decline and rebirth exemplified in the Vitae. And Mariette's scholarly work is marked by a tension between, on the one hand, a sense that artistic renewal is possible, and that examples of past greatness can be mobilized to better the future. And on the other, a sense of living in a time that was less culturally elevated than what had come before. His work was also shadowed by a palpable anxiety, an anxiety more characteristic of the 18th century, that such a rebirth would not in fact come to pass. So preserving art historical knowledge and the artistic achievements of the past thus took on a particular urgency. I'm showing you here, this is a medal struck by the French Mint to commemorate the 200th anniversary of Mariette's death. So this is from the 1970s. And I show it here because it recognizes something that we also see upstairs in the exhibition, which is the attention he devoted to restoring art. I can't really read this, but it says, discovers art and saves it from the fury of time. And in this project, saving art for posterity, Vasari was an exemplary model, not so much for his historical method, but for his forward-thinking work of collecting information and preserving visual evidence for the future. And I'll close with Mariette's own comment, quote, "However partial, however erroneous, in the end, one must always return to Vasari." Thank you.